Well, let's just go and get started. I'll just briefly introduce our speaker. I'm Dan Slater. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. Thanks for coming out for this talk. More people coming in. This is great. Real pleasure today to welcome Adam Ziegfeld from Temple University. Adam got his PhD at MIT and spent a couple of years at the University of Chicago, where I got to know him quite well, working on comparative politics of India. And he wrote a book that came out with Cambridge in 2016 called Why Regional Parties, on the regionalization of the party system in India. And I'm sure everyone's aware, recent elections in India, we really wanted to get someone out who really knew the case well, knew the history, could really speak to what's going on in India from a historical perspective. And I'm sure you'll all agree, after seeing Adam present, it's going to be really great to get his perspectives on what's going on now, but again, from a long-term perspective as well. So Adam, thanks for coming, and forward to your talk.
Great. Well, first of all, Dan, thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks to Derek for making sure that I arrived here safely and taking good care of me while I'm here. This is, I think, my 4th or 5th time in Ann Arbor. It's always a pleasure to be here. Volume?
Is this switch on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So the talk that I'm going to be presenting today draws on some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, a series of papers that look at trying to understand single-party dominance, particularly in the context of democracies. And so I think a good sort of starting point for thinking about this question is, there we go, a quote from sort of the eminent political scientist Adam Ziegfeld, who says, "Democracy is a system in which parties lose elections." But we actually know that there are a healthy number of cases out there, a healthy number of countries where elections are free and fair, but where there is actually a party that does not lose elections, or at least does not lose them for a very long time. So examples would include the African National Congress in South Africa, which has ruled uninterruptedly since 1994. Mapai, later the Labour Party in Israel, which governed for nearly 30 years uninterruptedly. The LDP in Japan for nearly 40 years. And then the Christian Democrats in Italy, that governed uninterruptedly for nearly 5 decades. So there is this class of political parties, what we call dominant political parties, that in the context of places where we think, again, elections are free and fair, but nevertheless, the same party repeatedly wins power for a prolonged period of time, repeatedly through multi-party elections. Now, in the sort of this literature on dominant political parties, the rule of thumb is often 20 years. So we sort of say a party is classified as sort of dominant if it wins, holds power continuously for about 20 years, which is usually about 5 or 6 elections. Which is it's quite unusual, right? Typically, it's not surprising for a party to win maybe 2 or 3 elections in a row. But when you start to get into territory of 5 or 6, this really sort of winnows it down to sort of an unusually small, or a very small set of cases. I think small but important. Now, the work that I've been doing has been mainly on a sort of different case from all of these, the Indian National Congress, which held power in India from independence in 1947 until 1977. It lost power briefly from 77 to 80. And so depending on how stringently one sort of takes this idea of uninterrupted power, people either date the end of Congress dominance either 77 when it first lost power or 1989, at which point sort of everyone's pretty much in agreement that things are fairly competitive. And so what I've been doing in sort of this work I've been doing is sort of on the one hand trying to explain this particular case, but trying to use it as a way of thinking more broadly about sort of this class of cases. That is, these dominant political parties that are not in the context of authoritarian regimes. They're not resorting to fraud and widespread violence to win elections, but are instead doing so what we think of as, again, sort of relatively, I would say, unimpeachable, but certainly electoral exercises that we think of as sort of genuinely reflecting the electorate's political preferences. And so what I want to do today is sort of work at both sort of a general level and the sort of more specific level, sort of posing sort of some abstract questions and then thinking about it more specifically in the context of India. So the question that I'm interested in sort of asking today is sort of what explains the electoral dominance of a single party in a democracy? And I'll look at that particularly in the case of the Indian National Congress, or Congress in India, and sort of ask why it is that Congress was India's electorally dominant party for so long. And the answer that I'm going to give is that it's this interaction of authoritarian era politics and the democratization process that essentially can create a party system, what I've come to call asymmetric competition, where you have on the one hand a large, institutionalized, organized political party with a lot of resources, competing against a bunch of small, relatively new, relatively disorganized, often resourced poor parties that essentially create the conditions that really stack the deck in favor of single party dominance. And so if we think about sort of this more general answer in the context of India, I'm going to suggest that it's the sort of authoritarian era, by which I mean the colonial era. The sort of colonial era divisions or political conflicts over independence and religion, sort of when those meet the democratization process, the sort of resulting party system or sort of landscape of political contestation is one that's highly asymmetric, where you're essentially left with, again, this one large political party that's relatively old, relatively well organized, relatively institutionalized, competing against a bunch of smaller parties that are poorly institutionalized and quite new. So this is sort of just the sort of general and more specific question and answer. Now, just to foreshadow, and I will come back to this all in much detail later, I want to just sort of signal sort of three things that I hope you take away. And these first two, I should say, I am not the first person or the only person to say these things, and I'm happy to talk a little bit at the end about sort of what I think is a little bit different here. But sort of one thing to take away is that when we're talking about single party dominance or dominant parties in the context of democracies, opposition parties are really, really important. Now there's at least one person in this room who is also sort of working on this and will tell you much the same thing. But I think in a democracy in particular, where you have these opposition parties that, right, they're not sort of constrained by a very uneven playing field. They are in some sense autonomous agents. That I think it's particularly in democracies where any story of single party dominance, where the opposition is not playing a key role, is one that I think is usually pretty incomplete. So that's sort of the first big takeaway. The second big takeaway is that these periods of authoritarian rule or prior authoritarian rule can shape these democratic party systems in ways that predispose the party system towards dominance. This isn't going to be a deterministic argument, but it's one that sort of, the idea is this interaction of authoritarian era politics and democratization can sort of create conditions that are more or less likely to lead to single party dominance. Again, I am hardly the first person to suggest that authoritarian era politics influences democratic politics, but I think this argument is a little bit different from, in sort of its flavor from others in the past. And then finally, what I want to do is sort of take some of these lessons and hopefully bring them forward to sort of think about contemporary Indian politics. For those of you that have been paying attention to the news, so the BJP recently won a very emphatic electoral victory earlier this year, and there's been a lot of talk about whether or not we sort of have in India a dominant party in the making. And what I want to suggest is that sort of based on the lessons from sort of India's prior period of single party dominance, it suggests that we should be quite cautious in sort of our prognostications about the BJP as becoming a new dominant party, in as much as the BJP does not really have the same structural advantages that Congress did 7 years ago. So these are sort of the three, I think, big takeaways. If you can come away from just one of these from this talk, I'd be really, real excited. Okay, so what I want to do for the next sort of 30 minutes or so is first sort of talk a little bit more about the puzzle, which is this idea of actual sort of dominant parties without electoral majority. So parties that remain in power for a really long time despite not actually being all that popular. I then want to give you sort of the general story of sort of this idea of how authoritarian era politics and democratization interact to create sort of a party landscape that is conducive to single party dominance or not. I then want to sort of take that story to the Indian case and sort of explain sort of a little more detail what sort of went on in India, sort of the inspiration of this argument. And then, as I said, sort of bring this forward and say sort of based on what sort of we can, obviously, right, the sort of historical specificities of the colonial era are clearly not reproduced in the 1990s and 2000s. We know that the BJP, this is not the same sort of situation, but are there lessons from this era that suggest that from this earlier period that can give us some hint as to whether or not we think the BJP is more or less likely to emerge as a dominant party? Again, sort of bearing in mind the sort of very political science definition of dominance, which has to do with the longevity of rule and focusing on sort of 4, 5, 6 consecutive electoral victories. All right, so first the puzzle. So let me just give a little bit of background for those of you who are not as intimately familiar with the Indian case. So right, when the British depart from India in 1947, Congress takes over under the sort of leadership of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. So Congress, the Indian National Congress, had led the independence movement. It won the 1946 colonial elections, so therefore dominated the sort of both the national level and various provincial legislatures, such that when the British left, they essentially handed power over to Congress. Congress then faces the electorate for the first time in elections held over the course of late 1951 and early 1952, and wins a single party majority, sort of remaining in power this time as a fully elected government. Congress then goes on to win the next 4 elections in 57, 62, 67, and 71. Loses power in 77. There's this period known as the emergency, which is a semi-authoritarian interlude. Sort of this period is ended. The opposition coalesces and ends up defeating Congress. The opposition party that comes to power ends up being quite fractious, collapses, and Congress comes back to power for about another decade. So again, people will vary a little bit on whether or not they sort of treat this period as sort of irrevocably ending the period of Congress dominance. Sort of for our purposes, it's not super important. The point is sort of Congress remains this dominant force in the 1950s, 60s, and into the 1970s. Now, right, a lot of people have looked at this question of why. Sort of why is it that Congress is this dominant party? Now, almost across the board, certainly in the literature in Congress, and I think we see echoes of a lot of these specific arguments in the broader literature, the comparative literature on dominant parties, almost all of these explanations have to do with the dominant party. So people will say, I think quite rightly, things that, as a result of sort of the Congress leading the nationalist movement, it sort of won the loyalty of a wide class of Indians who were opposed to British colonial rule. Other people will talk about Nehru's sort of charisma as a sort of, towering political leader who was seen as sort of, sort of not corrupt and sort of one of the sort of the lead, sort of founders of modern India. An argument that you find sort of, again, in the Indian literature with Rajani Kothari, but then also in sort of the broader comparative literature with the likes of William Riker, is this idea of sort of ideological consensus, that Congress sort of sat in the center of the political spectrum, sort of emphasis on democracy, secularism, and socialism, really sort of embodied sort of the broad national consensus, relegating sort of any other political parties to the other extremes of the left and right. Others, again, this is more specific to India, have talked about sort of the way that Congress handled India's tremendous ethnic diversity. So whether it's heading off sort of linguistic conflicts by reorganizing states along linguistic lines to effectively diffuse a lot of the linguistic demands, to the way that Congress is able to sort of exploit, especially local caste divisions for political ends. So there's more sort of, again, India-specific explanation. And then finally, sort of a long line of arguments dating back to sort of Myron Weiner on sort of patronage and state resource. The fact that, right, basically the British hand over the reins of the state to Congress. It therefore has sort of this unlimited sort of, well, not unlimited, they certainly had very finite budgets, but sort of a lot of jobs, a lot of resources to sort of hand out in a politicized way in order to generate political support. Now, sort of, I think this, certainly from the India side, is the literature. Again, I think a lot of these, particularly the state resources and ideological consensus, to some extent sort of legitimacy arguments, again, we see in sort of the broader comparative literature. Now, I think what all of this would lead you to believe is thinking like, wow, so everyone was voting for Congress. This party was wildly popular. Not really. So the graph here on your right is Congress's vote shares in national level elections from 1951 through 1989. The dashed line is 50%. So what we see is that in every national election, most people did not vote for Congress, right? It did well, right? It's not to say it did poorly in any elections, but right, this is not a party like, say, the ANC in South Africa, that when it gets below 60% of the vote, suddenly they think it's a catastrophic election. If Congress ever won 60% of the vote in an election, that would have been like, they would have been over the moon. So what's going on here? So how is it that we have this dominant party that's not necessarily winning tons of votes? Well, one answer, sort of like political science 101 as well, it has to do with the electoral system, right? India uses single-member district electoral rules, aka first past the post, right, like we use in the US, Canada, UK. So the green dash line here is just the seat shares won by Congress in legislative elections. It is a parliamentary democracy, so these are sort of what matter for who comes to power. And what we see is, not surprisingly, right, as the largest party in sort of the party system, it benefits disproportionately, winning a pretty large share of seats in the legislature relative to its seat share. Again, not surprising, right? We have a party that's winning 40% of the vote in every constituency, but because it's competing against smaller parties, it can win nearly all of the seats in the legislature despite winning, far less than all of the votes. But what I think is we often sort of is mentioned in India, but sort of not really problematized, is right. What also matters here is the opposition, right? It's the fact that Congress was the largest party despite not winning a majority of the vote, right? With less than, say, about 40% of the vote, Congress doesn't have to be the biggest party. The red line here is the vote share won by the largest opposition party. This is a different party actually in most elections, but it's just whichever party is the largest. And so what we see is, with this exception of the 1977 election, which again occurs on the heels of this semi-authoritarian interlude, right? The largest opposition party in India is really, really small. And so part of this explanation is the electoral rules, but the other is the opposition. But the question, I think the thing that's been certainly not adequately explored in the Indian context, and I think in a lot of the dominant parties literature has also sort of been, I think, inadequately theorized, is sort of, well, what explains this fragmented opposition? Why don't we get sort of a consolidated opposition when it's pretty clear that that's a sort of very good way to counter the dominant party? And just to sort of put a finer point on this and have a bit of a digression, Notice the scale here. This is only from 45 to 50%. So this is, the green is Congress. So this is basically what I showed you before for the first couple elections. But what I have on this figure are the vote shares won by the Conservative and Labour parties in the UK during the same period. So you'll notice at no point, roughly the same, if we're looking at the same period, the Conservatives in the UK always win more votes than Congress. The Conservatives are not a dominant party because unlike Congress, which faces this highly fragmented opposition, right, the Conservatives in blue here are facing a fairly consolidated opposition in the Labour Party. So neither Labour nor the Conservatives are able to take advantage of electoral rules, sort of consistently win single party majorities. And so the idea here is, right, sort of this party size is relative, right? In India, we say like, oh, Congress is huge, in part because we're thinking about it relative to all these tiny parties, when in fact, it's actually no bigger than the Conservatives or Labour Party, neither of which are dominant during this period. And so this sort of leads to this question of what explains this asymmetric competition? Why is it that we have, on the one hand, this large party against, this is the same figures I showed you before, just with some, showing the alphabet soup of party labels that sort of change who the largest party is from election to election. But basically sort of why it is that you end up with this asymmetric competition between, again, this emphasizes the size of the parties, but we can also think of these smaller parties that are often new, poorly organized, relatively resource poor. Sort of what explains that? And so that's, I think, the puzzle that I'm really sort of interested in. And so the argument that I'm going to advance today, at least sort of in general terms, has to do with this interaction between authoritarian era politics and democratization. So, I think naively we often think sort of like, oh, well, there isn't that much politics going on during, closed authoritarian regimes. But, a ton of people tell us like that's really not true, right? Where there's politics or sort of there's contestation potentially within the regime, between different factions within the regime. Even if you don't have elections, you still have those who are potentially contesting the authoritarian regime. There's a lot that's still potentially going on. Now, the question is, when we get to a period of when democratization occurs, sort of what happens to those lines of contestation? Now, the argument, I'm not going to make an argument here that sort of a particular thing happens with democratization, in part because, right, democratization itself is a really heterogeneous set of processes, right? In a place like, say, Latin America in, say, the 80s, right, democratization was about the retreat of the military back to the barracks. In a place like Mexico, right, it wasn't actually about the military retreat in the barracks, it was about the leveling of an uneven playing field. And so the process of democratization can be quite different. So the ways that democratization may or may not upset existing lines of political contestation are likely to vary. And I'm going to argue that it's precisely that sort of variation in the extent to which democratization does or does not sort of upset these existing lines of political contestation in the authoritarian period. They're going to help us gain some leverage on sort of the extent to which sort of this interaction is going to sort of tip the scales in favor of a dominant party system or not. So let me just start with sort of the pathway that is going to sort of, I'm going to present in abstract terms, but as sort of a heads up, it's going to be sort of how I'm going to think about the Indian case. So, right, one possibility is that when you have this sort of authoritarian political contestation of the authoritarian regime, you have democratization. One possibility is that basically one of these sides becomes pretty irrelevant, right? So you can think about a very stylized version might be sort of like with a colonizer and the colonized, that sort of you have this contestation between these groups. Well, you have democratization, which essentially means the colonizer ups and leaves. You may end up with one side, in this case the colonizers, who are completely discredited. As a result, you sort of have one side surviving, sort of the anti-colonial movement. The other, the loser, in this case quite literally exits. It doesn't always need to be sort of an actual physical exit, but the idea sort of, you can imagine that the process of democratization, that you could also think of this as just sort of, particularly oppressive autocrat who's just sort of kicked out and universally reviled. Essentially, that camp basically loses and effectively withdraws from politics, leaving one side that sort of has been active in the authoritarian eras, potentially engaged in a lot of mass mobilization, institutionalization, facing basically nothing. Well, we think sort of politics probably abhors a vacuum, sort of you're not facing nothing for long, but what that means is that whoever the sort of winner who was active for years prior is facing is much newer, often much less well organized, and then often much less well financed. And so the idea is that, again, this is not deterministic, but it sort of is much more likely to stack the deck in favor of this asymmetric competition, where you have the sort of legacy of sort of this, again, this winner from the authoritarian period who remains in power, but then faces this set of much newer, typically less organized and often fragmented set of opponents. So again, this is sort of going to be the case for India. Now, importantly, sort of as a way to try to think about this, I mean, this, full disclosure, right? So this is all sort of generated from the Indian case, but I think we can think sort of abstractly that this is not the only sort of way that democratization can play out, right? We can also think of a lot of instances where it may be that the lines of political contestation in the authoritarian era may be relatively unaffected. So if we think about a case where, basically the authoritarian era, you have, say, elections, but they're maybe not that free and fair, it may be that by making them free and fair, by, say, like, just freeing up sort of access to the media or no longer harassing opposition leaders, that might not actually really alter the lines of political contestation all that much. So basically the groups that were active sort of when things weren't free and fair are still there when it is. And so you can imagine these same parties are surviving. You have parties that are on both sides institutionalized, active, entrenched, ties to society. You're much more likely to get a competitive party system. Again, this is not meant to be deterministic. You could still imagine a set of circumstances that doesn't lead to it being as competitive. But the idea is you don't have this kind of asymmetry on both sides. I think Sri Lanka would be a good case. I hope there are no Sri Lanka experts out there who push me too hard on this. But because the democratization process in Sri Lanka was actually quite different from India, and sort of the anti-colonial movement was far less robust, things really sort of, and universal suffrage was implemented in Sri Lanka before the British left. Essentially, it was sort of, things didn't change too much with the departure of the colonial power. Another way of thinking about sort of a similar set of predictions would be, you could imagine that the authoritarian era political contestation becomes irrelevant, but maps onto some other division. So if we think that, say, there's a division between the authoritarian elite and the opponents, but then that maps, and that disappears when you democratize, but if that also maps onto, say, a class division, where, say, it's the upper and middle classes who are in the authoritarian camp, and the opponents are more working class or different ethnic groups, you can imagine that these same parties can actually survive by just rebranding themselves in sort of a different dimension, even though the existing division has become sort of less relevant. So you get sort of the same thing, where basically you have the survival of these sort of authoritarian era organizations, and this being much less likely to have this asymmetry. I think Mexico is arguably a case of this, where again, because sort of democratization was this leveling of the playing field, the regime dimension sort of goes away, but then you're left with a left-right dimension that most of the three main parties, the PRD, PAN, and PRI, map onto relatively well. Again, I'm not a Mexico scholar, so this may, sort of interloper's rendition of the case. And then finally, I think we can also imagine a situation where it could be that sort of the entire sort of line of contestation are rendered irrelevant. Full disclosure, I don't have a super great empirical referent for this, so if any of you have ideas, I would love to hear them. The one that's sort of the stylized one in my head is sort of imagining like kind of like 19th century Britain in this sort of fight between the sort of landed elite and sort of the industrial oligarchy that, imagine the UK had become universal franchise much quicker than it did. You can imagine that division between this tiny elite becomes irrelevant. These groups are too small to sort of be viable in a truly democratic context. That division might become completely irrelevant. You're left with something of a political vacuum, which is likely to lead to a fairly fluid party system. And so in some sense, this has echoes of Rachel Riedel's work actually in Africa. But again, I think it is less likely because if you're sort of in this system where sort of there's essentially a political vacuum and sort of everyone's new and inexperienced, again, it's less likely that one of these parties is going to come out on top or sort of enjoy the structural advantage. So again, the idea here is not that sort of you can't imagine dominance in these other systems, but it's this idea that sort of when one side wins in the democratization process and the other loses, it sets up this sort of structural advantage that seems predisposes the party system towards dominance. Okay. So having said that in the abstract, I want to sort of take you through sort of how I think this explains or sort of why I think we can think of the Indian case in these terms. So during the authoritarian era, which I'm going to call the colonial era, which I think we can actually think of as being fairly similar to a contemporary electoral autocracy, where you have sort of meaningful elections, but at the end of the day, when the sort of British have final veto power, like this is not at the end of the day a democracy. The franchise, I should also add, was highly restricted. And actually, elections weren't held in a good chunk of the country. So lots of reasons to think of this as not a full democracy prior to 1947. Where the two main issues in India during the late colonial period are these twin issues of religion and independence, which actually end up being quite intertwined. So this is just a map of India, which I realize is actually not appropriate for the time period because it still includes Burma, which by the independence was actually no longer part of British India, but let's set that aside for a second. So British India is this patchwork of these areas in pink, which are directly ruled by the British, as well as these areas in yellow, which are the princely states, which are ruled indirectly by the British. And right, you would think that the Indian political elite would be sort of universally opposed to British colonial rule. But in fact, there were actually sort of quite a lot of gradations. So you have on the one hand Congress, which spearheads the independence movement that is vociferously opposed to the British, right? The Quit India movement is about getting the British out at all costs, even during World War II, sort of saying like, we don't really care what's going on in Europe, what we care about is getting the British out. You have a number of other political parties at the time that are sympathetic to the independence movement, but are not necessarily as adamant about as Congress about sort of getting the British out immediately. You then also have a sizable share of the political class that is actually pretty deeply ambivalent about the prospect of independence because they're concerned about their place in an independent India. So most notably, you have the Muslim League, which was founded in early 1900s to represent the interests of Muslims generally, but more specifically the Muslim landed elite. So this is a map of India. The darker shades of green are areas with larger Muslim populations. So what you'll see is, basically this is contemporary Pakistan, contemporary Bangladesh. So in British India, Muslims were about a third of the population, so a minority, but a very sizable minority. And importantly as well, the Muslim landed elite had been really sort of privileged under the British. And so what they were concerned with was retaining these privileges in a post-independence India that was going to be numerically dominated by Hindus. And so there was a great deal of ambivalence about the prospect of independence because of sort of this idea of like, well, what's going to happen to our privileged position when we no longer have the numbers to back this up? And so you actually have, so you not only have the Muslim League, you also have other parties associated with landlords that again were sort of ambivalent about independence. In South India, you have the Justice Party, which was a party headed by non-Brahmin elites who were actually quite ambivalent about independence for a different set of reasons, that they viewed Congress as being Brahmin dominated and were concerned about sort of their status in a Brahmin dominated, in India governed by a Brahmin dominated Congress. And so the Justice Party was actually sort of not all that keen on the idea of independence for a while. So you have sort of a surprising amount of sort of variation on this issue. It is then also with the Muslim League very much bound up with the idea of religion. So although the Muslim League eventually came to advocate for the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan, it initially said, no, we're fine with an independent India, but we need all sorts of institutional safeguards to make sure that our rights are protected. And so Congress, on the other hand, said, no, if we're going to be this secular democracy, we're not going to have these institutional safeguards because we're not a Hindu party, we just happen to be a party that has more Hindus in it than Muslims. So you have these sort of twin issues of religion and independence that are really animating the late colonial period. So independence comes along, and with it, the partition of India and a new constitution. So the partition of India, right, creates Pakistan, which at the time was West Pakistan, today's Pakistan, and then East Pakistan, which is today's Bangladesh, and then sort of the rump, India. So because these tended to be Muslim-dominated areas to begin with, and then you have a massive migration and population exchange, British India's Muslim minority of about 1/3 becomes about, today it's about 13%, so at that time would have been about 11 or 12%, so a much smaller minority. So, right, independence and partition happens. Clearly this sort of independence issue is no longer on the table, right? The British have left. But importantly, these issues of religion are also largely off the table, which they have come back on the table to a large extent in the last couple of years, but for a long time were off the table. So this idea of secularism, which in the Indian context is not the separation of church and state or mosque and state or temple and state, so much as the equal treatment of all religions, is enshrined in the Constitution. Separate religious electorates were abolished. So in colonial elections, Muslims basically voted for a set of seats in which their representatives were necessarily Muslim. So you had different parties competing for the Muslim seats and different parties competing for the general seats, which were effectively Hindu seats. But this was a way of essentially, in advance, specifying the religious composition of the legislature. So this was abolished entirely, and in its place there was established a set of reservations, which is a sort of Indian version of affirmative action, based entirely on caste and tribe, not at all based on religion. So basically any sort of state benefits associated with religion, or sort of any sort of, basically sort of the state basically says there's nothing attached to religion in terms of hiring, office holding. It's all, if there's going to be any sort of positive discrimination, it's going to be on the basis of caste. And importantly, with a few exceptions, most of the big parties in India are essentially on board with this, in part because the Muslim minority is now sufficiently small and geographically dispersed that there's not sort of real much in the way of electoral gain, but certainly most of the parties are really on board with this. So these issues of sort of associated with independence and religion essentially go away, and these sort of pro-British and religious forces are largely discredited. So basically what it's saying is the Muslim League survives, and importantly, the Muslim League exits. And by exit, I do actually mean most of the leaders actually left for Pakistan. So sort of the far and away largest party. So basically in the colonial era, we have Congress and the Muslim League. The fonts are intentionally different. This isn't because I was careless. These are actually much larger because these represent much larger parties. And then you have some smaller parties here. I mentioned the Justice Party, the Communist, the Akali Dal is actually a party associated with the Sikh minority in Punjab. Basically, the Muslim League, the Unionist Party, and the Justice Party, which are, perhaps not coincidentally, those that are most closely tied with the colonial power, basically disappear entirely. The Hindu Mahasabha, which is a sort of a Hindu party, is more or less discredited. You're basically left with Congress, and then the Communists and the Akali Dal, which are, I'm happy to talk a lot more about, but are quite small and regionally concentrated. So you're again left largely with this vacuum where the big player, sort of the big counterweight to Congress, effectively disappears. So what you end up with is this world where you have Congress on the one hand against this set of parties that are much smaller, much less experienced, and often poorly organized. So in particular, you have sort of on the eve of the first elections, 3 big splinter parties, all from Congress. So the Socialist Party, which was originally a faction within Congress, that leaves in it's expelled actually in 1949. The Kisan Mazdoor Praja Party and the Krishakar Lok Party, these are essentially factions of disgruntled Congress politicians who are annoyed at whoever won a factional fight, and they decide to leave and form these political parties. Importantly, these are pretty leader-heavy parties. They're pretty urban. They don't really have much in the way of organization. That has remained with Congress. They don't have much in the way of sort of organization in rural areas where, importantly, about 90% of the population resides. So these are new parties. They don't have much in the way of organization. They don't necessarily have sort of a deep well of personnel. So they're not particularly well equipped to really sort of viably challenge Congress. You have some parties that are new to elections. So the Bharatiya Jansangh, which is the predecessor of the BJP, is the political wing of an association called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangha, the RSS, which is a Hindu revivalist organization that dates back to the 20s, but was not involved in electoral politics until really the eve of the first election. So you have this party that's okay, so it has some roots largely in urban areas, again, which doesn't really help you in a country that's 90% rural, but is electorally wholly inexperienced. Has no experience selecting candidates, canvassing, finding party workers, certainly no experience trying to coordinate ahead of elections with other opposition parties. The communists actually also fall into this category. So they're actually somewhat more experienced, but because they were following sort of Moscow's orders for a lot of years, we're actually not that focused on elections. And so when it came to actually, when they finally did contest elections, they actually weren't very good at it for a while. They were very emphatic about nominating candidates with unimpeachable ideological credentials, and didn't seem to pay much attention to things like sort of the caste demography of the constituency, which ended up being quite important. And so for a long time, they were not very good at competing in elections. It took a while for them to sort of get their footing. And then you end up with a few parties that sort of emerge, the Ram Rajya Parishad and the Scheduled Caste Federation, sorry, that should not be highlighted, in the Akali Dal, which are sort of reasonably successful, but are very sort of regionally concentrated. And so again, sort of the takeaway here is that you have sort of this, Congress on the one hand that has been mobilizing sort of a national audience for decades, and has been doing so through sort of mass mobilization, reaching out and sort of identifying sort of workers and party activists in rural areas, that has this sort of existing cadre of leaders from whom to draw for elections, against this group of parties that are pretty small, don't have much in the way of political organization, are often quite inexperienced. Again, to echo some of the themes from Elvin's book manuscript over here, right? One of the solutions here could have been electoral coordination, right? They could have said like, all right, we're gonna just field one opposition candidate in each seat. They weren't really very good at this because they didn't have a lot of experience in elections. And so again, the idea here is that given the sort of political vacuum, what Congress is facing is really sort of an opposition that's not really very effective, but I think it's not surprising that it wasn't very effective given sort of the vacuum in which it emerged and how quickly many of these parties needed to emerge. So all of this is to say is you're to end up in this situation where even sort of the biggest and most effective of these parties is really quite small. So the Socialist Party, which was sort of the Congress's biggest opponent in 1951, 1952 election, I think contested fewer than half of the seats, right? These are parties that they can't even find candidates to contest in most seats. Even if they can, they don't really have much in the way of an electoral organization. These are parties that are sort of on their own, poorly equipped to challenge Congress, and again, sort of not really all that good at sort of coordinating with one another either. So the big takeaway here is that it's this interaction of sort of the shape that colonial era politics took with the democratization process that creates this vacuum. And so I think the counterfactual here would be sort of like, well, there's a couple. One would be sort of, had the democratization process gone differently, like had, say, India not been partitioned and you had these two big parties, I think the argument is single party dominance would have been a lot less likely because you would have had this big Muslim League that admittedly was not sort of the same. I think most people would say it sort of was probably not as equipped to contest elections because it was much more elite focused. But the idea is you would have had this sort of large counterweight to Congress that likely would have been in a position to, or would have at least potentially been in a position to anchor an alternative coalition government. The other counterfactual would have been like, well, what if the politics of colonial India had been more around caste rather than religion? Well, then you might have actually, the democratization process might not really have necessarily upset politics in the same way, and you might have had sort of multiple parties sort of that emerged in the colonial era that continued into the democratic period. And so again, it's sort of not an argument that there's sort of this determinate outcome from this interaction, but it's sort of when we think about sort of this interaction between authoritarian era and politics and democratization that you can potentially sets the stage for this asymmetric politics that I think can really sort of stack the deck in favor of single party dominance. Okay, so having said all of that, I want to say a little bit about sort of the BJP. So for those of you that sort of, well, if you've been paying attention recently, you know sort of the BJP won a big election. As recently as 2009, the BJP was not sort of in a bit of sort of a funk. It decides to choose Narendra Modi as its sort of leader. All of a sudden, its fortunes sort of start to improve. In 2014, the BJP, it's not surprising that it wins the election. It is a little surprising that it wins a legislative majority. Then in 2019, it defies a lot of skeptics who were, again, most people were probably pretty convinced that the BJP was going to win. I think relatively few sort of impartial observers expected it to not just enhance its legislative majority, but enhance its vote share by quite a lot. So it is certainly on the upswing, has done quite well in a lot of state elections, which has then prompted sort of a lot of people in the media and sort of observers to talk about the BJP as potentially a new dominant party. Now, in fairness to a lot of these people, they're not necessarily using dominance the way that I am, and so they're not necessarily saying like, well, is this party going to be in power until 2034, making it 20 years? But I think that sort of this is sort of interesting question. We have a party that is clearly the preeminent political party, and clearly the largest party, and clearly the one that has sort of the largest membership, sort of best campaign machinery. And the question is sort of, do we think this is actually going to translate into a new period of dominance? And I think there's sort of two sort of lessons we can draw from the Congress period that sort of can help us think about this problem. So the first is sort of, well, do we see sort of a discredited or absent opposition? Now, obviously, we're not going to see the sort of, flight to a different country that you see with the leadership of the Muslim League, but this is this question of sort of what is the main opposition to the BJP look like, which is namely Congress. So this figure plots the vote shares for the BJP here in orange and Congress in green, starting from 1991, which is the first election in which these are the two largest parties. So what you see is that, yes, sort of this gap between Congress and the BJP in 2019 has really opened up. So this difference between the BJP winning about 37% of the vote and Congress winning about 19%. It's not all that different from what we saw in 1991. Importantly, 2014 was really basically sort of looked like 2009 with just the parties swapped. And so, there's a lot of reasons. I think there's a legitimate fear that Congress has sort of not reached its sort of its floor, so to speak. But as of right now, we're not talking about a BJP that faces sort of no national opposition. Congress's biggest problem right now is the fact that its vote shares don't translate very efficiently into seat shares, which is a very real problem. But it's not as though this is a party that has either sort of fallen apart completely, nor is it one that's particularly stigmatized, right? It's not as though other parties in India wouldn't form a coalition with Congress. So I think in that sense, the BJP today does not face sort of this discredited or absent opposition in the way that Congress did. The other, I think, lesson, right, is that sort of, well, what sort of replaced, that would kind of emerge in this vacuum was this very fragmented, uncoordinated opposition. And so the question is sort of like, well, what does the opposition really look like to the BJP? Well, if we look at the national level, this is just the distribution of legislators in the Lok Sabha. It looks like it's really fragmented. You look at this and say, like, look at all these colors aside. The orange is the BJP, this is Congress, and all the rest are the 25, 30 odd regional parties. If you're interested in regional parties, read my book. And so you might say like, oh yeah, so like this is this really fragmented opposition. Importantly in India, because state level party systems vary so much, what we really need to do is sort of look at the state level to see how fragmented this is. And if we actually look at the state level, in fact the BJP typically faces less fragmented oppositions or sort of opponents than Congress did before. So just to give you an example, So Karnataka, which is a state in South India, so this was a state, one of the states where Congress was most successful for the longest. So in 1962, Congress wins about 50% of the vote. So it's one of the few states where it actually does cross this 50% threshold. But you'll notice, right, sort of the other parties, extremely fragmented. Importantly, independents winning a huge vote share. This is really bad news for opposition coordination because it's really hard to get independents on board. And so if you're thinking about how much of the vote share Congress would need to lose to its biggest opponent in order for the opponent to be credible, or how much coordination you would need to get all of these parties on board as an electoral alliance, like this is bad news for the opposition. Like things are looking good for Congress in this scenario, which not surprisingly it governed in Karnataka for a long time. Fast forward to 2019, right? The BJP is in sort of a similar position as Congress. I should say these are from national level elections, not state level elections. The BJP is winning about 50% of the vote, did really well in the last election, but almost all of the remaining vote is amassed between two parties. The main opponent, Congress, is actually still pretty large. So if you think about the share of the vote share that the BJP would need to lose in order for Congress to become the largest party, it's actually not all that large. And importantly, it's not all that hard for the opposition to amass most of its vote behind two parties. In fact, that's exactly what happened in this election. Congress and the Janata Dal Secular formed an alliance. It wasn't effective enough because the BJP won a majority of the vote. But the idea is sort of both opposition coordination as well as sort of effectively countering the BJP is not nearly as the uphill a battle as it was before. And so if we think about sort of opportunities for how fragmented the opposition is at the state level or opportunities for coordination, things arguably look less good for the BJP in terms of its sort of future of dominance in most states than they did for Congress. There are other good dimensions we can look at. I should say I have a paper coming out in India Review if you're interested in this, where I do talk about sort of in a little more detail sort of the BJP's sort of the extent to which it resembles other dominant parties. Sorry, this is really small, but if we also just look generally at the party size, right? The BJP in elections that it's won, 20% of the vote, 26, 31, 37, like this is just not a big party by sort of global standards, right? Like winning 38% of the vote in most democracies, or actually not most, in many democracies is not all that remarkable. We are not talking about a party that, for all the talk about sort of the BJP's formidable electoral machine, which I think is not unfounded, it is still a party that is nowhere close to sort of winning the votes of most Indians. Moreover, for as much as the BJP has really expanded its footprint across India, it is still not really a viable player everywhere. So this figure plots the percentage of seats in which the largest vote winner is competitive. So competitive in this case is defined as either coming in first or second and winning at least a quarter of the vote. So in these first elections where Congress is the dominant, it's basically competitive in almost all seats. The red circle is the 2014 and 2019 elections. So you'll notice is that the BJP is still only competitive in less than 70% of seats. So there's a 30% of the country where it's just either not competing because it's in an alliance or is competing but winning very minimal vote shares. And so if we think about sort of how easy it is for a party to continually win a legislative majority, when you're only competitive in about 2/3 of seats, it means you need to win an extraordinarily high share of the seats in which you're competitive in order to win a legislative majority. And so these are, I think, some of the other sort of setting aside sort of the lessons from Congress. I think if we think about these other dimensions, it's not to sort of, I guess, sort of, I don't want to go on record as saying there's no way the BJP is going to become dominant. I do think, however, unless the BJP is still on the upswing, it doesn't really have that many of the characteristics associated with dominant parties. Whether we think about sort of India's prior dominant parties, so drawing these lessons from Congress about sort of the nature of the opposition or sort of some of the other characteristics, the BJP doesn't really have many of the same characteristics or advantages that we associate with dominant parties, whether in India or elsewhere. So again, I think we can certainly imagine a lot of scenarios where the BJP is able to win 3 more consecutive elections and remain in power. But I think given sort of its electoral footprint, given sort of the nature of the opposition and sort of how we think about sort of dominant parties in India and elsewhere, it's not necessarily, I think, a bet one would want to take unless we're sort of quite confident that the BJP is still on the upswing, which I think a lot of people would argue that it is. And so I think that's the sort of million-dollar question. So coming back to the takeaways, again, I think when we're talking about single-party dominance, particularly in democracies where there are not these sort of constraints imposed by fraud and violence on the opposition, I think the opposition really has to be a very crucial part of understanding single-party dominance. And that in a lot of countries, now, depending how recent or not the authoritarian past is, this may or may not be relevant, but I think in a lot of cases, particularly sort of the ones that are transitioning from electoral autocracy, I think sort of what goes on in the authoritarian period can really do a lot to sort of either enhance or diminish the likelihood that you get this sort of asymmetric competition. And then again, bringing these lessons sort of forward to today, I think that we have reason to wonder whether or not sort of the BJP really does have the same sort of structural advantages that Congress did many years ago. So with that, I will conclude and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, you can see the sea of humanity a little better than I can, so I'll let you field your own questions as hands arise.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Matthew. This was a great talk. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
So I have two questions. The first is, can you tell me a little bit more about how Congress performed in the 50s and 60s? And I ask that because kind of in my mind, the crux of your theoretical argument is that this vacuum is filled by new parties that don't organize well, like poorly resourced, so they just can't compete. And my kind of curiosity was, well, why don't they just organize better? Like, why don't they coordinate faster to deal with Congress? And I suspect it has to do with the fact that people like Congress. And so, like, Congress might not have a majority of support, but people might perceive Congress as effective, or like mostly taking up the policy space that parties would want them to take up. So if new parties emerge, they're emerging on like the policy fringes, so they're not kind of generating enough new ideas to generate support. So that's one curiosity I have.
Okay.
And then the second is, I just think you need to do a bit more. Like, I understand why you are trying to separate yourself from the process of democratization, like how that occurs. But I wonder whether you can do that, because you think that pre-democratization, as parties see democratization coming, they will attempt, like it is in their interest to manufacture that process in such a way that they benefit in the future. So, I imagine that as Congress sees democratization coming down the pike, it thinks, okay, well, we're in a decent spot if X, Y, Z happens. So I'd be curious to know, like, how Congress saw this process and what they thought during that period of time.
Yeah, so those are really good questions. So on sort of this competition in the 50s and 60s, I mean, part of this issue is sort of like, why don't they sort of organize or coordinate faster? I mean, I think part of this is that this is a bit of a sort of hypothesis. I mean, or sort of hypothesizing on the fly. I mean, I think a lot of this has to do with sort of the urban-rural divide in terms of where leadership comes from versus where the votes are, in the sense that I think you have this political class that is predominantly urban, and yet most of the votes are to be won in rural areas. And so I do think there is this difficulty in terms of trying to sort of break into rural areas among people that sort of aren't from there, don't sort of have many ties there. And so I think that's part of it. I mean, I think we're also, like, realistic in the 1950s and 60s, we're talking about places with pretty poor sort of communications and transportation infrastructure. So there is a part of this, like, it's just physically not easy to get to a lot of these places. And so if you don't have sort of a stable of like local notables who are already sort of in the party that you can sort of count on at election time to either sort of enjoy a sort of a lot of support on their own, or to then be able to sort of mobilize and sort of know who's out there to canvass and sort of get out support. I think these challenges were sort of genuinely significant. I think in terms of the sort of coordination, I mean, it's interesting reading. So Myron Weiner has some, a book, I think it was written after the 1957 election, and really talks about, like, a lot of these parties were just really surprised by how popular Congress ended up being in the first couple elections, and so they didn't necessarily think that these divisions were going to matter as much. And then I think, there are these questions of, and again, I'll point to Elvin for, this is, I think, his work as well, these sort of disagreements over, like, who was going to contest where, who was actually strong. I mean, I think there are a lot of sort of obstacles to this coordination, that particularly in a very fluid party system where it's even after sort of 3 elections, you don't necessarily have the same 3 parties all the time. And so I think sort of knowing sort of how best to coordinate, I think, some measure of optimism bias that sort of, oh, this is going to be our big breakthrough, we don't need to coordinate. I think that these things are I mean, I think it took time. And I mean, the answer, let me see, I think I got a backup slide here, which maybe, yeah, I mean, I think basically what happens is where the challenges to Congress come in are parties that were already better organized sort of just started to expand, and it took a while. And so it's not surprising. I mean, I have actually other work that talks about sort of the places where Congress was challenged the earliest was places, particularly where the communists, which again, were active but weren't sort of active in elections. And so essentially for a long time sort of got it wrong. They're like, oh, we're gonna have these sort of like, these people that have these really, they're these staunch Marxists and they're really good organizers. We're gonna field them as candidates. But hey, they're actually Brahmins in a constituency that's 5% Brahmin. Turns out that's a pretty bad strategy. And so I think part of this is just learning among parties that don't have, aren't doing this, don't have a long history of doing this. At this point, elections are actually clubbed together with state and national. So by the time 1962 rolls around, this is only the third election any of these parties have really ever competed in. So I think there's genuinely a sort of not much experience, but I do think it is about sort of like learning and sort of these parties sort of taking their organization and increasingly sort of deploying it more to rural areas. So I mean, that's sort of like a multi-piece argument. I will say about the policy thing, I mean, this is actually where I think, so interestingly, a lot of these parties are, these parties are effectively indistinguishable from Congress.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think the point is that they're not on the fringes though. So the idea is, I mean, I think you could make the argument that sort of like, well, why vote for them if they're basically the same? But this is very different than say like a Ken Green argument that basically by occupying the center, everyone else is electorally unappealing because of their extremity. None of these and their successors, who are the main opposition to Congress, none of these parties are extreme in any way. They basically look very much like sort of Congress's sort of left flank. So in that sense, I think it's not that they're unappealing from a policy perspective. I think it's that they're pretty poorly organized. They don't have great candidates. They're not like sort of fielding people in that many places, things like that. To your second question, so that's a good, I mean, this idea of sort of like managing the democratization process. I mean, I think, Congress certainly had some say, but at the end of the day, right, it was the British who decided when they left and under what terms they left. And I think, very often I think, and certainly like Dan can speak to this far more than I can, I think very often it's, democratization occurs on someone's terms. I mean, I think in the case of India, at least, and this maybe sort of limits its generalizability, I think it was democratization occurred on the terms of no one who ended up being a real political player, right? This was sort of, democratization didn't happen because of the way Congress said it was going to, right? I mean, I don't want to sort of diminish the role of the independence movement, but right? The British were exhausted after World War II and left in a hurry for a reason, right? Partition, particularly in the form that it took, Congress was opposed to partition, right? That was not what Congress wanted. If Congress were in control of the democratization process, partition would not have happened. And so I think,
I don't know much about India, but that I find very interesting. Like, why? Like, if given that the outcome was that partition just handed them a third year, like.
I mean, I think genuinely, I think that most Congressmen were ideologically opposed to it. I think they're like, this is India, and we're not. I think most leaders were like, we're not Hindu nationalists. We're not trying to create a, Hindu Rashtra. We're trying to create an India that's open to everyone. And so why shouldn't Muslims be in it? And so, I think at least on the part of Congress, I think it was genuinely ideological. They were committed to a sort of secular India. And so there was no reason to forfeit, a large part of the country.
Yeah, I missed the first 15 minutes of your talk. Maybe you talked about it a little bit, so in case. But I'm wondering, you identify 3 different routes to sort of post-colonial outcomes in terms of their democratization processes. And can you talk a little bit more on more analytical and general terms in terms of the first route and the second route? Because there's a lot of cases, for instance, in the context of Africa. Once again, minimal background on African context, but it's always, you keep on hearing the same thing in terms of that transition from colonial times to post-colonial times, where there is a strong continuity in terms of leadership. Despite the fact that here's the interesting part, they are the ones, the winners, in your model, who really got the colonialists out. So can you clarify a little bit more in terms of what is the distinctive features that really determine these separate outcomes? Is it the actors themselves? For instance, you identify Congress, Muslim League, but they are basically actors, political parties represent certain interests. Are the interests also consolidated under different contexts, or so what is the distinction between the two paths that you identify?
Between, let's see. Okay, so let me just say one thing, and then which may not get to your question. I mean, I think in a lot of the sort of post-colonial African cases, I think we sort of are on this trajectory, but then democracy ends, right? That basically these are sort of, I think if you imagine a lot of these sort of post-colonial African cases, they were basically, I think, headed toward asymmetric competition, but rather than sort of continue on with democracy, they just said, well, let's sort of get rid of these elections. And so I actually think in some sense, I mean, the idea here is this sort of, it's meant to apply to democracies, but I do think if we lived in a world where once you became a democracy, you couldn't go back, my wager would be that a lot of these post-colonial countries would actually be sort of in this top part. Now, in terms of sort of what separates this, I mean, I think, and again, this is where, I think it's certainly not like all that parsimonious, but I mean, I think the issue is that democratization takes so many forms that it's hard to necessarily say that democratization will do X to a particular set of sort of lines of contestation. And so it's not certainly necessarily making this prediction that sort of this is your type of authoritarian, or these are your type of lines of political contestation. Democratization is going to get you one of these three things. It's sort of, well, you should take the set of contestation and this particular form of democratization, it may do different things. And so trying to think through in sort of a semi-exhaustive way of sort of, well, you can sort of have both of them survive, one can survive, neither can survive, like you sort of have these, unaffected, they basically both sides, sort of lived in a stylized world where you have two sides, they can both survive, one can survive, or down here, neither can survive, and sort of, I guess, I don't know enough about these to feel confident making sort of a more general claim about sort of when you get one of these three, one of these three. But basically sort of this idea of thinking about part of what explains how you get here is what happened before, and then this process that gets you to democracy, which again, in different contexts just looks so different, right? Thinking about like the democratization process in, say, Bhutan, where the king just says we're having elections now, versus Argentina, where it's the military says we're going back to the barracks, post-communist Eastern Europe, where we say we're having multiple parties. Again, these are just such different processes that I think it's, again, sort of, I don't know, I come in this more on sort of the party side than the democratization side, so maybe those with sort of a more expansive knowledge of this world could sort of make better sense of this than I, but I'll say that for now that's above my pay grade. Okay, so let's start on the very way back, and then I'll maybe move over.
Thank you very much for this one. I have a more zoom out historical question. It seems to me there is a more dynamic process of competition to the claim of nationalism between secular and religious forces that could help us better understand the dominance of the Congress Party and its decline and the emergence of this new BJP as an emergent dominant party. And could you please elaborate on that more dynamic process maybe?
Yeah, well, so that is for sure, for sure, I think I don't know if I say quite conventional wisdom, but a lot of people would say, like, right, this is sort of the ideological consensus argument is, well, everyone was pretty secular, and that's why everyone supported Congress, sort of these notions of secularism erode, and suddenly we get the BJP. I guess my skepticism with that is that, well, one, I don't think we have the public opinion data to back this up in the sense that I think we know what elites believe. It's wholly unclear to me that sort of the Indian mass public was ever all that behind secularism. Even if it was, then we sort of have problems of, if you look at Congress's decline, it's really piecemeal state by state, and I think that's hard to reconcile with these sort of big national explanations about sort of declining, sort of endorsement of these sort of big political ideas. Like that doesn't, to me, help getting leverage on why Congress collapses, by the 1970s in Tamil Nadu, but remains really strong in Maharashtra until the 1990s. Like, it's not, like, I don't think that that's, I think, so anyway, so I think that is certainly an explanation that's out there. I mean, I guess I am a little skeptical of sort of thinking of Congress dominance as being sort of this, voter-driven endorsement of a particular set of ideological principles, and more having to do with, Congress did a really good job of nominating sort of local notables or people who were pretty good with sort of dispensing stuff or sort of mobilizing sort of local coalitions. That's sort of my sort of predisposition in terms of viewing politics in this period. And so to me, I'm sort of like, well, Congress was just a much better political machine. So I think that is an idea that's out there about sort of these ideas of religious nationalism and secularism. And I certainly should say, full disclosure, I don't have the evidence to debunk that because, again, I think we're sort of don't necessarily have great evidence either way. But I think it would need to sort of explain some things that I think it would be hard pressed to do in terms of thinking about like subnational variation, in terms of the Congress's decline and the BJP's rise. So second row from the back, yeah.
This is more of a zoom in question. Why I'm yet to be persuaded by your picture. This is a national level picture.
Yeah.
Does this mean when you talk about a variety of democratization processes that we might see a different democratization process if we look at elections on a different scale? So before 1960, Congress is not dominant. It loses an election in Kerala, a major state. By 1970, it's lost several. If you look at municipality elections, I think it's an even much different story, and it'd be very hard to make a picture of a dominant party. So if there are not dominant parties in the sense that you've defined them nationally at regional and local levels, then whatever you're saying about the relationship between the authoritarian era or colonial era conditions explaining dominance will not hold at these other levels. So it seems to me that something more must be done than just looking at colonial period nationalist politics and positions, because there are effective parties, or at least certainly Congress being defeated all over India from almost the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, so one, I couldn't agree with you more, and I should say, like, so this sort of group of, this is one of a group of papers, and this is actually the only one that looks at the national level. All the other ones are actually looking at subnational variation. So, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree, and I mean, just sort of as a general endorsement of sort of, like, my view of Indian politics, if anyone tries to tell you there's like this big national story, like, it's probably not true, because there's just so much going on, often going at sort of cross purposes at the state level.
If you had said that at the
yeah,
beginning,
no, fair enough. So I do think, I mean, but
in your paper suggests.
But I do think, and fair enough. I do think, though, that as a broad generalization, if you look at sort of, especially like the 51-52 election, the number of places where Congress faces a really robust sort of opposition are pretty small. Now, again, going back to this way at the end, I sort of back up. Right, there are, oops, uh-oh. Sorry?
You can use that mouse.
Oh, thanks. All right, well, I won't show it to you because it's going to take too long. But I think it's not surprising that it's precisely in some of these places. I mean, like, basically that I still think there's a colonial era story, actually, in as much as I think it's the fact that you had the predecessor to the DMK that was pretty active in sort of like grassroots mobilization in Tamil Nadu. It is therefore not surprising that that is one of the first places where Congress sort of really, I mean, in Kerala it loses power, but then because it's sort of the coalition that comes to power is pretty fragile. It's really sort of Tamil Nadu where Congress decisively loses power for the first time. And I think it's not surprising that that is precisely where sort of you actually have a legacy of colonial era mobilization. Again, it takes them a little while because for a long time sort of they back away, as the DK, they back away from actual electoral mobilization. And so I think it sort of takes them a little while. But I think it's not surprising that that's where this sort of challenge happens earlier. The same thing with the communists. So I think it is precisely actually in these places where at the subnational level where this sort of story doesn't hold quite as neatly. Those are precisely the places where I think you see the challenge to Congress arising much earlier and much more effectively. But I think sort of as a broad national story, and I actually think part of the reason I think this is sort of an important story is I actually think sort of the national story isn't really oddly enough, I think in the comparative literature, the sort of national story isn't in there as much, and there actually is a lot more emphasis on the subnational level. And so I think we have better explanations for the subnational level. But I think, again, sort of as a general story, I think the truth is across most of it, many of the princely states, the Muslim League was the main opposition. You had, sorry, not princely states, the direct rule states. And then in the princely states, there Congress was far less well mobilized, but certainly was really the only kind of often game in town. And so I think,
Well, except for Telangana, Hyderabad.
yeah, that's true.
Major exception in dominating Indian politics in the mid-1950s.
Right. No, for sure. But I mean, I think I think at least from a national level, right, you don't need to win 100% of the seats. You need to win a lot of them. And so I think in that sense, I think the sort of, it is for sure sort of a stylized picture of national level politics, but I think it's one that gets us to where sort of Congress is able to win enough seats that sort of those pockets of relatively early opposition. I mean, right, even from the beginning, right, Congress lost a quarter of the seats. It's not like there's sort of no one out there, but sort of the idea is when a lot of this opposition comes in the form of, and I apologize for getting really into the India weeds for other people, like, if you're talking about Rajasthan and you're talking about sort of a bunch of Rajput notables who refuse to sort of like ally with anyone else, but they're just like, well, no, this is, this is my land, I'm gonna run. Like, that's not sort of the basis for sort of like a sustained national level opposition. And so I think the fact that that was in a lot of places, or it's much harder, right? Because then you're starting to coordinate not just a bunch of parties, but then also a bunch of guys in their ego. Like, I mean, so I think that for as much as you do have this sort of like localized, genuine opposition, I think the fact that it was sort of so disparate and so fragmented and often sort of so personalized and uninstitutionalized, I think that is part of the explanation sort of for why it sort of, this doesn't really aggregate up into a real challenge to Congress for a while. But I mean, for sure, I think that, yeah, there's a very interesting subnational story that I think is consistent with this, but somewhat different. Yeah, so third row from the back.
This was very interesting, thank you. I have two questions. You've hit them a little bit with some of the other questions. The BJP, for them to suddenly, after the Congress Party winning so often, suddenly the BJP takes and wins 2 elections in a row. Now in a Western democracy, that would show a major shift, maybe temporary, but a major shift in the thinking and the direction of what were people dissatisfied about that suddenly caused the shift that a third party could suddenly rise. Yeah. Like that, and so that I don't know that you fully addressed that. That would be very interesting to know, because you were really saying that even though they've won 2 elections, they're still a very unstable third party, and you don't really. It sounds like you don't really predict them to continue that on that path. But a major shift like that in a democracy says that there's something going on. Yeah. Okay, that's one question. The other question. In America, you said that they could only win 70%. They were in 70%.
They're only competitive in about 70%
of the country. They can only win, and if they can only do that in 70% of the country, that makes them a little on the weak side. Yeah. But in America, the Democrats win in the areas that have the most population, and the Republicans win in 2/3 of the country where there's very little rural population. And they can be still quite successful. So what about the split in India between how people vote in urban areas versus the rural areas? What was that breakdown like? And I don't think you ever addressed it caste, as I recall.
So the caste, I think, will come into the first question. So the second question, I mean, generally speaking, so India doesn't have quite the malapportionment problem. Well, it doesn't have a terrible malapportionment problem. It does in ways that things are well apportioned within each state. There is malapportionment between states. So some of the less populated southern states are somewhat overrepresented, which actually works to the BJP's disadvantage because those tend to be places where the BJP is substantially weaker. People have talked about an urban-rural divide. I mean, that was truer when the BJP was actually a sort of more predominantly upper caste party, and the urban areas have tended to be, right. Because India's relatively recently urbanized, the cities were often sort of predominantly upper caste, not predominantly in the sense of, want you to think it's like 90%, but sort of disproportionately upper caste. And so certainly the BJP is seen as somewhat more of an urban party. That has changed a lot, particularly in the last couple elections. But so the malapportionment thing I think is not necessarily a huge part of the story. So in terms of what the BJP, what's different, the BJP basically since the 1990s has been a predominantly upper caste party. It is in most states where it is relatively popular is the preferred choice of upper castes. Who those upper castes are often varies from state to state. What it has effectively done in a lot of states has expanded beyond that. In some cases, like Karnataka, it depends how you think of, again, I don't want to get too much of these, but Lingayats, depends if you think of those as upper caste or not. But in certain states, it has cultivated, it's done a very good job of sort of cultivating support among relatively large caste groups. Some of the strategies that it's embarked on in other states is to actually, where you have parties that are, I'm going to give a good example that's relatively accessible if don't read the Indian newspaper every day. So in the state of Haryana, the largest castes are the Jats, who are about a third of the population. There's one party that's historically been associated with the Jats, and then Congress of late had there were these two big parties, this regional party and Congress, and of late Congress had been sort of courting the Jat vote. What the BJP, which has traditionally gotten the upper caste vote, has done, I think, quite successfully in Haryana, is basically try to win the support of all of the other castes, all of these other little groups that are too small on their own to sort of have like a party that's sort of clearly associated with them. This has also been sort of what it's done arguably in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state, is basically try to peel off groups that are sort of not sort of the core groups of many of its opponents. And so that sort of has been part of the story in a lot of these states, is sort of basically trying to cobble together the support of smaller groups. There are also arguments about sort of aspirational from an economic point of view, sort of the rising middle class. Those are sort of aspire to sort of, or maybe lower middle class, or sort of aspire for upward mobility. That sort of the BJP under Modi has sort of effectively captured those groups. I think, I haven't looked at this closely enough, so I wouldn't sort of lean too heavily on this, but I don't think in most cases, there are some exceptions. It's not that the BJP has necessarily fundamentally undercut the core support for other parties, but I think it has effectively aggregated sort of the support of those who are not closely tied with a political party. So in particular, if you think about it from a caste point of view, again, because there's caste heterogeneity, there's so many different castes, it's not as though sort of everyone has a party they can vote for that's sort of closely identified. I think it's done a pretty good job. And so I think that is one argument. Again, there's these sort of economic arguments about sort of Modi tapping into this sort of aspirational middle class. I think there's some evidence of that. I think it's a little, again, we don't have a ton of public opinion data, so a lot of this stuff is sort of the best guesses. Yeah. I think in the front and then
So in listening to your story, I wonder if in placing the blame at fragmentation of political parties in the post-independence era, you perhaps do a disservice to the astute electioneering capacity of the Congress party, because it seems to me that the urban-rural divide that you cite is in some respects as much of a problem for the Congress as well, given that a lot of the Congress's elites in the era of independence were as elite as you can get. Jawaharlal Nehru was a Cambridge-educated gentleman. His father went to Cambridge. A lot of the other leaders were enormously wealthy, and to me at least, the reason why they were able to counter that urban-rural divide was just that they understood, the plight of the common man better than other parties did, and they were able to connect with them. They also had a more kind of socialist outlook than some of the other more fragmented parties at the time, and I wonder if you've kind of given that enough credit in your story.
Yeah.
The second quick point that I wanted to make
write this down.
With respect to the sudden resurgence of the BJP, I think that the other aspect of the story is the implosion of the Congress in many respects, because contrary to, your argument about, the aspirational middle class kind of voting for the BJP, one of the biggest topics in the discussion during that 2014 election was the rampant corruption that took place in the Congress Party for the last sort of 10 years immediately prior. I mean, 3 of India's largest corruption scandals took place under the Congress's auspices at that time. So I wonder really then if perhaps the BJP is here to stay, because at this point at least there's a real widespread perception in India that Congress is the party of dynastic rule and corruption, and that BJP is everything else. And so I wonder if you're too quick to perhaps dismiss that dominance argument.
Yeah. Okay, so on the first thing, so for sure, I mean, it is like, right, if you think about this, especially the sort of upper layer of Congress, right, you were dealing with an incredibly elite, incredibly urban group of people. I think the difference is, and here sort of thinking about like some of my tutors' work on sort of Congress and the nationalist movement, I think Congress spent a long time finding allies in rural areas. And a lot of these times these allies were still relatively elite, but we're talking about sort of like local landlords, sort of local notables, people who are not necessarily sort of this Cambridge educated sort of urbanites, but are people that sort of, whether we think of sort of, you know, traditional ties where they're sort of, you know, kind of a not particularly democratic sort of sense of, you know, sort of relying on their sort of financial and their economic independence for support. You know, I think in that sense, Congress did do a lot, right? I think a lot of sort of the nationalist movement was precisely about showing to the British that, like, we aren't just a bunch of Brahmin lawyers, that we are in fact, you know, sort of active in the countryside. And so I think, you know, I do think in that sense, Congress did sort of do a lot, and I think did do a lot, and especially if you think about sort of getting some of these people on your team, and then sort of now you're the people in charge with all the money and things, you're sort of like, why would these local notables then defect to another party? So I think I take the point, but I do think that sort of Congress had done a lot sort of in terms of sort of rural mobilization. In terms of the BJP, yeah, I mean, right, for sure part of this is about Congress. I do think though, like, you know, if you look at where Congress's vote share is, right, like a non-trivial share of its decline is the formation of the YSR Congress. Like it lost a big, which is like sort of neither here nor there when it comes to the BJP. You know, you could say like in Delhi, the fact that sort of Congress is lost to AAP, that could be sort of laid at sort of Congress's door in terms of corruption. But I do think, you know, I mean, I think to me your bigger point is actually, the way I would read it is, the BJP's done a very good job of seeming to convince people that Congress is corrupt and that it isn't, or that Congress is about dynasticism and the BJP isn't. Because if you certainly look at the number of, so outside of the top leadership, right, Narendra Modi himself is not a dynast, but if you look at who the MPs are coming from the BJP, the levels of dynasticism, at least as of 2014, so the Kanchan Chandra's volume on dynastic politics, they're lower than Congress, but we're not talking about a party that is, you know, this is not a party that doesn't nominate dynasts. This is not a party that doesn't nominate criminals. You know, I think part of it is more about sort of the BJP is actually probably just better at convincing people of these things than I necessarily think that it's, you know, sort of, I guess I don't, you know, I don't want to say like they're all corrupt, but yeah, so I don't know how much, but I do think sort of to your point, I mean, I think thinking about sort of like what the lessons are here, right? If Congress does completely unravel and become sort of like basically fragmented into a bunch of sort of regional parties, then I think we are probably in a place where the BJP does have a pretty rosy future as far as, I guess I just think, I mean, part of this is just thinking about 2009, right, which was just not that long ago. People were talking about like, could the BJP ever really challenge Congress, right? And like this was, not because Congress was super wildly popular, it was just the BJP was in the doldrums. It had lost, you know, it was sort of a distant third in Uttar Pradesh where, you know, sort of counts on for a lot of its seats. And so I think there is this sort of very short memory that people have when it comes to elections in India and sort of forgetting just how short a time ago it was that the BJP seemed. So again, I think I would not certainly put much money on the BJP not winning in 2024. But if we're now sort of thinking about 2029, I just think a decade's an awful long time. Dan, and then.
Yeah, so you've gotten a lot of questions, so let me hit you with just a comment.
Okay.
Just sort of a reaction to the possible generalizability and the ways this might travel. Mm-hmm. So what I did when I kind of got the thrust of the argument was say, okay, well, let's kind of do a little 2x2, right? Just sort of say, where do we get, just thinking in terms of colonial transitions, mm-hmm. right? and keep it within the region, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and sort of say, well, where we get these kind of discrediting, disruptive transitions from colonialism, out of colonialism, do we get dominant parties or not? And you've got, there are cases on the diagonal and on the wrong diagonal, right? So but then I've been thinking about the mix of them. So here's what I'm sort of finding. So consistent with your story, with the India story in particular, Burma, very, very consistent. Very similar kind of mode of transition, total discrediting of the pro-British political class, AFPFL, definitely a dominant party, only disrupted by coup, right? Sri Lanka, which I've actually been reading a bit about for a separate project, I think also that's right. You know, they basically, I'll come back to this, but where you do indeed get no single dominant party with this very, very smooth transition, right? Also the Philippines, same story. No dominant party, very much a smooth transition from colonialism. Now, off of the diagonal, going the other directions, Indonesia doesn't work in the sense that you definitely had super discrediting of colonial elites, but you do not get dominant party in Indonesia. And then within the British Empire, Malaysia and Singapore, which are certainly dominant party systems. Now, it might be another story, but and they had certainly much more pro-British, so the handovers of power were way, way, way more sort of peaceful and full of continuity than the Indonesia case. Okay, so what do we make of this? So what I would make of this is the following. I think it's good to stick with these colonial transitions. And essentially what you've got is, like, the idea behind the colonial enterprise and decolonization is what you might call, like, Duverger's glide path, right? That essentially what they're trying to do, certainly the British, right, what they're trying to do is transition very gradually, in Sri Lanka they actually pull it off, to essentially two-party rule, because it's going to first past the post elections. So barring some kind of disruption, you should be able to glide more or less into two-party, you know, Duverger's law, right? And not have opposition failure, have two-party system a la like we saw in the UK story, right? And that works in Sri Lanka. It doesn't work in Malaysia and Singapore for a variety of other reasons, to do with violence, eventually authoritarian takeover and the like. But the interesting thing, in Burma, it gets disrupted for the same reasons in India. But so the Philippines is now interesting because there too, it's not specific to the British, but it is specific to decolonization going into a first past the post electoral system, right? And then again, in the Philippines, very much like Sri Lanka, what you have is Duverger's glide path occurs because you don't have any serious disruption of or discrediting or stigmatization of opposition in the process of decolonization, right? So I think the way I would think about this is British Empire, but particularly these cases that are trying to decolonize toward electoral politics with these first past the post systems. And then there's a variety of ways this can get disrupted, and you've got these stories in India, but I think more generally, you could think of a set of ways in which it could, and it's not only British, because the American case also, I think, fits it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So again, I mean, let me caveat this. You know, I'm going to say something about Malaysia and Singapore, and I know there are a lot of people in this room who know so much more than I do. I mean, I do wonder, it does seem like, thinking about, like, certainly Malaysia, that, right, there was initially opposition. The issue is that sort of UMNO decides to sort of have this sort of basically bring everyone into the fold. And so, I mean, I guess, right, I mean, again, sort of thinking this is not deterministic, but it sort of makes me think that sort of, and maybe this is wrong, sort of like, had UMNO not sort of taken, or I guess whatever the predecessor was, sort of taken this position of trying to sort of like rope in sort of different communal representatives of the various groups, sort of, it does, if you think of these lines of contestation, basically sort of, was sort of Malaysia actually set up to be a competitive system, but you end up with this sort of, basically party sort of being like, well, no, we sort of figured out a way around this. Which I don't know if that's maybe one way of saying that sort of, this doesn't work very well when we start adding authoritarianism in the mix. Yeah, so I don't know, that's sort of just a
well, it's civil war, is I think the point in Malaya. So in Malaya, what you get is, to the extent they would have again loved the glide path to something where you have UMNO and you have something like, you know, the MCA, right? You have these parties, but they end up coalescing. The reason they coalesce and the British kind of forced them together, and the reason they're amenable to coming together is because of the communist threat, right? So again, that's a disruption of your glide path, right? That's the thing. And so I think the idea that particularly the British, the idea that the British could have this glide path to independence was almost nowhere true. Like Jamaica, they pulled it off, right? You know, two-party system, right? You know, Sri Lanka, they pulled it off, two-party system. But most places, something disrupted it, and it shakes that up in some way. But I think starting with that default, the idea, like, why do we see divergence from just that kind of real two-party system sort of thing? And then obviously regionalism. There are all kinds of things that can disrupt it. But I think starting with that as a baseline model in a way would be helpful for thinking about then why it doesn't play out, or plays out in different ways in these different cases. In a manageable set of comparative cases rather than just some kind of global rule about, and here's Mexico or whatever.
Yeah, well, so I thought a little bit about South Africa and Namibia, which are different because these are actually our countries where a vast majority of people actually do vote for the ANC and SWAPO. But I had sort of thought of these as like basically once sort of the race/regime question is off the table, you end up with a winner. The losers are sufficiently discredited that they don't exit in the same way that the Muslim League does, but they're basically small, and you don't really have much else going on because SWAPO and the ANC have been sort of around for so long. And so it isn't this puzzle of sort of dominance without electoral majority. But so those were actually the ones where I thought of, and again, sort of, I think those are the ones where it's sort of like, they're pretty clearly democratic. And so, but so that is interesting to sort of think of that as the,
thank you for the presentation. I have two questions for you. The first one is kind of like shorter, simpler than the second one. I'm kind of wondering, going back to the model that you proposed of decolonization and how it goes to democratization, how do we best fit the history of the United States into that model, or is it possible for us to fit the history of the United States into that model? And the second one is more kind of an abstract kind of a question. You talked a lot about how the process of decolonization give a certain party of this, post-colonial country a sort of advantageous head start, becoming a dominant party. Is it possible for a new dominant party to emerge after the first dominant party to get rid of? And do you have any historical cases of it? And what are some conditions that for it to happen?
Yes, okay, those are two very good questions. In answer to your first question, gosh, I never thought about the U.S. In this context. In part, I mean, just because I guess the sort of, well, depending on, if we think of democratization as sort of decolonization in the U.S. versus sort of thinking about Southern sort of democratization, sort of bracket that, which we probably shouldn't, but I guess I sort of never thought of the U.S. because it's just sort of, we're dealing with a world that's just so fundamentally different in terms of sort of thinking about sort of democracy and dominant parties. That being said, that's my way of saying I haven't thought about that. Maybe I should, but that's why I think I hadn't. In terms of new dominant parties, I mean, yeah. So the answer is, I mean, well, so at the subnational level in India, you certainly have, so in the state of Gujarat, for example, the Congress was dominant for many years. The BJP has been in power in Gujarat since, I think, 1998, so it would qualify as a dominant party. The state of West Bengal had Congress as a dominant party, and then the CPIM. So certainly you can. I do think that those are probably somewhat different processes, in as much as I think this sort of transition, sort of this new sort of the sort of creation of democracy, sort of new democratic elections versus sort of forging dominance through sort of a free and fair election process, I think is probably different. I will say at the national level, the only example, actually I don't think I can, I take that back. Austria actually had a period of, the same two parties were in coalition for like 50 years, and for the first 20, one of them was the senior partner, and then for the next 20, the other one was. Other than that, which, and again, Austria is like just sort of a super weird case of basically grand coalitions of the two main parties in power for a very long time. I can't think at a national level of one sort of dominant party, the sort of single party dominance for one party then giving rise to another. I still think the intuition would be somewhat the same, that I think these sort of, and there's actually some work that has shown that like basically sort of dominant parties are more common sort of when they're often the sort of the first party in like a new regime. So I do, but I'm inclined to think that the processes are probably somewhat different, but I think it's a good question.
Well, unfortunately, Rob Mickey had to run out, but I think he'd probably say the American South is a pretty good example after the Civil War, that you have a completely discredited party, and
Yeah.
so you end up with a single party rule for a very, very
Yeah,
long,
there the
long,
question
long
is
time. It was a democracy.
certainly not a arguably
Right.
not a democracy.
That's
so,
right. That's right. So in terms of electoral,
Yeah.
sort of electoral doors. Anyway, so we're out of time, but thank you so much for the talk and all the great questions.
Yeah, thank
So
you for the questions.
Thanks so much for coming out.
Yeah, thank you.